Welcome to the Land and the Bible podcast. I'm here with Mr. Jameson Creel. Say hello to the people.
How we doing?
We're doing really good. We're right now in the middle of this ongoing episodic of Jesus Galilean ministry, which we're just episodes upon episodes in. I've lost count.
Depends on how you count them. 3, 4, something like that.
Yeah, they were counting them in handfuls. But yeah, so
binary, like
exactly.
1010
I'm feeling good. I've got my immune support drink right here, just to stay nice and healthy. In case anyone's wondering what this is. What are we getting into today, though?
I want to talk about one day that Matthew tells us about in the life of Jesus. So we have, I think we talked about this in an earlier episode also, the idea that we don't really have that many days of Jesus's life that we know anything about, so we assume Jesus lived about 33 years, give or take, multiply by 365, and, he lived 11 or 12,000 days, however that works out.
Yeah.
Of those days, we really only have information on 50 or 60 of them. We have the day he was born, the day they fled, to Egypt, the day they came back, the day he went to, then you skip to he's 12, and you have the day he went to the temple, and, maybe a day or two after we headed back home, a little bit something like that. And then you skip till he's 30. But even during his ministry years, we have certain days, like maybe when he was tempted by Satan in the wilderness, that 2 or 3 of the authors record, and some days only one of them records. But you add it up, it's between 50 and 60 days that we know something about. And so, but there are a few times in the Gospels where we get a window on a day and just sort of get a little bit of an idea of, what were those 1,000 or 1,200 days of his ministry, those 3 years. What was that like? What did that look like? And then you start thinking, like, what was it like to live out that over and over and over and over and over again? Because John says, I didn't tell you everything. I just told you enough so you could believe. And if I wrote it all down, it would have filled up all the books in the world, he says, at the end of his epistle, of his gospel. So we know that there's a ton we don't know. And so it's helpful or interesting, I think, when we can get a window into a day and think about what that was like. And the day that's recorded in Matthew 14 is it's a crazy one. It's a wild one, and I want to focus on it. It really maybe should be 2 lessons or 2 sermons or whatever you want to call it, or podcasts. But for the sake of just getting the whole story, let's try to condense it into one. And I want to focus on 2 events that happened that day. One is Jesus finding out his cousin had died. And the other one is Peter walking on the water. Okay, so I just want to sort of hit those 2 things, and just think about what can we extract, from those 2 events, and just kind of go from there. I think is what we would like to do. So the background, sort of the prologue, if you would, of Matthew 14, is it tells us about something that was going on in the royal family with Herod. And it says this, I'll just kind of read about it. It says that Herod had arrested John, chained him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Okay, so here's what that means. Herod, this is Herod Antipas, if I remember correctly. It's not Herod the Great, it's a descendant. And he is living in an open, not even trying or pretending to hide it, affair with his brother's wife. Okay? So at some point, he looks over at Philip, sees Herodias, Philip's wife, and thinks, I like her. And so apparently she liked him. And so they were just openly flaunting, this sort of, weird, immoral, I guess you would say incestuous, sexual affair that they were having. John the Baptist, being a fireball, prophet type, calls him out. You know, like, you can't lead Israel. You're sinful. You're sleeping with your brother's wife, you know, which, I mean, I think most people would agree that that's not proper behavior. Sleeping with your brother's wife is not okay. So John calls him out on it. Herod doesn't want to kill John because, first off, he knows John's right, but the Bible says because he feared the people. Like, the people are with John. The people agree that this is immoral, bad, wrong behavior. Herod just doesn't care because he's the king and I can do what I want. And he liked her enough to deal with the consequences. So he's sort of living in this affair. He doesn't want the criticism. He's scared to kill John, so he just arrests him. And he's like, well, I'll just lock him up and hold him, you know, and hopefully he'll shut up. And whenever he'll shut up, then I'll let him go. Well, you know, John's probably not great at shutting up, so he stays in jail. And then there's this really, really bizarre scene where it says, when Herod's birthday celebration came, Herodias' daughter danced before them and pleased Herod. Okay, so, you know, what I think you have to be really clear on here is that this was not, you know, it wasn't like the chicken dance or, you know, the Macarena or something, you know, you know,
it was the Cupid shuffle.
Yeah. So it was, you know, her dancing before Herod and pleasing him was, you know, certainly seductive, sexual, you know, evocative, you know, whatever word you want, inappropriate, you know, to use a current word. So you got to think about the perversion of these people. So this is Herod's sister-in-law who he's having an affair with, not even trying to hide it, totally open. And then she brings in her daughter, who is his niece, who then dances sexually for him, and he likes it, to the point that he says, I'll do whatever you want, up to half my kingdom, which, okay, there's some hyperbole there, but, you know, he makes this open promise. And then Herodias, who doesn't like, you know, being called bad names by the prophet, says to her daughter, hey, we want, you know, John's head on a platter. So Herod doesn't want to do it, but he made a promise in front of people. And so, hey, for pride's sake and to keep this evil woman happy and whatever, he says, okay. And John the Baptist, they send some soldiers, they chop his head off. They bring the head in on a platter. Now, this has got to be one of the most unjust, awful, horrific. I mean, it's horrible, right? There's nothing about that that's good. These are perverted, depraved people killing a good man who had the courage, you know, to sort of speak truth to power. Mm-hmm. For the sake of their depravity. You know, it's just evil all around, right? It just seems like evil winning. And so that's bad. It's dark. It's a dark story. It's a dark event. Everything's bad about it. And so that's the background of the chapter. Well, what happens then is that word gets to Jesus. You know, remember, there's no telephones, there's no cell phones, there's no Facebook, you know, so it has to travel on foot. So we don't know if it's a day or two later or whatever. But Jesus gets word that John has died. Now, again, you have to remember, they're cousins. You know, John the Baptist and Jesus are cousins. They've known each other from birth. They're only 6 months apart in age. John was slightly older. And these guys they love one another, you know. John embraced the idea that he was clearing the way for Jesus. He said as much in his ministry. Jesus had a super admiration for John. He talked about him being the greatest, you know, man born to women, that like of all the humans that have come up until now, this is the best one. Well, that's pretty high praise coming from the Son of God. You know, so Jesus has a ton of admiration and love for John. And you know, Jesus, and you have to think about it from his perspective, you know, he's the Son of God. He has the ability to do things that most people can't. And, you know, he could have tried to have done something miraculous to free John, but that wasn't God's plan. John was supposed to decrease so Jesus could increase, and John's disciples needed to become Jesus's disciples, and so it was time for John to move off the stage, and this is, what the mechanism that God used for that. But that doesn't mean it's not sad and it's not awful, and that there's not a lot of, that Jesus. So Jesus hears this, and he's intensely emotional. Okay, I think sometimes we just read words. We don't. Imagine, your cousin that you grew up with. It's like a brother to you that someone really close to you dies via horrific injustice. Is murdered by awful people for awful reasons. In how what are you going to feel in that moment? How angry are you going to be? How sorrowful are you going to be? How sad are you going to be? And Jesus he's a human. He feels all these things, right? So he's intensely emotional in this moment. And this is what the Bible says. It said when Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. So even Jesus is wounded, he's hurt, he's sorrowful enough that he's like, I just want to get alone for a little while. I want to cry, I want to pray, I want to process for a little while, for a day, for a few hours before I carry on. And that's just so totally normally human. Mm-hmm. Whatever you are in life, whether you're a business leader or a dad or a wife or a, father, mother, whatever you are, it's normal to have a day like that. It's normal to get, kicked in the teeth, punched in the stomach by life somehow. You find out something happened to your mom, or something happened to, your family, or something's wrong with your job, or, whatever. Life happens. It's something painful happens, but then also in the middle of all that, here's all these other demands. You want to step away. You're like, I just can't handle it. I mean, as a business operator, I'm sure that from time to time you deal with employees that are, like, this thing's happened in my family, I need to take a day. And, if you're a nice, decent human, I'm sure in most cases you give those things, or, maybe I'll just crack the whip around here and, have no personal whatever. But, I know for us as a school, and, when I was operating that, there were times when people had events and they would call in and be like, hey, I need a day. I'm like, all right, take a day. You do what you gotta do with your family, So Jesus needs a day. Even Jesus needs a day. But here's what happens. It says, when he went ashore, he saw a large crowd, had compassion on them, and healed their sick. So you have to imagine the whole thing. Jesus is on one side of the Sea of Galilee, of the lake. He gets this news. He's devastated. He's like, guys, let's just get on the boat. Let's get out of here for a little bit. Let's go. I need to get away for a little bit. He's sorrowful. He's sad. By the time he gets the boat to the other side of the lake, the people have chased him around it. There's a crowd there waiting. And instead of getting to have his go cry it out, just have a meal with your 3 or 12 guys that you're close to, kind of a down day so you can process. Instead of getting that day, here's 1,000 people that want to hear him teach, be prayed for, be healed, showing up with their needs with absolutely no care for his. That's the day you find out somebody you love died, but you still got kids and you still got to take care of them, and you just got to function, and it's not any fun, but you still got to. And in the thing there, and this, to me, this is one of the most human moments in Jesus's life and ministry, because it says he had compassion on them. So even in the midst of his hurt and his sorrow, he still has space to be a compassionate person. And I think that's a big deal, because I think what we do oftentimes is, have you heard the term displaced anger? It's like something happens at work and I'm just generally angry. Mm-hmm. And so then I get home and yell at my wife or my kids.
Right.
That's kind of what we do.
Yeah.
We tend to get hurt here and take it out somewhere else is what we do a lot. I've got some friends who are counselors, they're in counseling, psychology, that kind of stuff. And they talk a lot about, it's kind of fluffy psychology stuff, but I think there's truth to it. They talk about your emotional cup.
Yeah.
And have you heard this analogy before?
Yeah.
It's actually really good, I think. They what they talk about is like that your emotional self is kind of like a cappuccino or something, that you've got sort of these layers.
It gets bumped.
Yeah. And so, a lot of times so something happens, which, is putting stuff into the cup, and then stuff bubble, when you overfill a cup, stuff comes out of it. Well, from that cappuccino cup, what comes out first is the froth on top, right? And then after that, maybe you get the coffee if you keep putting stuff in it. But the point is, what gets pushed out of the top may not actually be what's causing the issue. And most humans would rather display anger than display hurt.
Right.
We don't like to look vulnerable. So like, instead of being like, I'm so sad because of, we do the angry thing, because we don't look weak, we don't look vulnerable. So we tend to emote. When we're hurt, we emote anger, instead of hurt. You don't want to like, as a guy, you don't want to, go in the office crying or something like, oh, it really made me feel unloved when y'all did this, like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I was just talking to staff about that recently. And we were talking about, this person's doing this. And it's like, okay, so what is the solution? It's like, well, they just need to not do that. We need to communicate, fill in the blank. It's like, well, we're never going to be able to communicate that perfectly. It seems like the real issue is that what they did was offensive. Do you found it offensive? Like, because it was a lack of respect. It's like, well, yeah, you should tell them it hurt your feelings. And it's like, because it did, didn't it? And it's like, yeah, but it's like, I bet it will diffuse the situation and they'll never do it again. Like, it's interesting. It's like easy to be mad, like you said. It's easy to be mad, but the second you say, that really bothered me, it hurt my feelings, it takes a really like mean-spirited person to be like, well, I don't care about your stupid feelings. Most of the time, they're going to say, no one wants to be the bad guys going around hurting people's feelings. Like, I don't want to be a bully. So they're just going to be like, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But if you go, you need to stop this. And they're like, why do I need to stop that? You need to do this because I'm doing my thing. And like, well, I'm doing my thing. Like, but if you go and you lead with vulnerability, it does diffuse the situation.
Which is, funny. Like I'll even see it in my marriage.
Yeah. Let's just apologize out of the gate.
Yes. Okay. So that's funny.
And that hurt my feelings.
So we talked about these. We talked about how like associative conversations, but when I was getting ready to get married, I went to a man who was one of my, I guess I would call him my mentor. He taught me how to work in the context I worked in for years, and spiritual guru, well of wisdom kind of person, and I said, give me some wisdom for marriage, and he said, well, you'll need to learn. I forget the number he said, 3 or 4 phrases. I forget exactly. He said, you need to learn some phrases. And I'm like, oh, okay, what? And he's okay, repeat after me. And then he starts in on, you're right, honey. I'm sorry, whatever you want. He starts going through all these things. And I'm like, okay, whatever. And there is some truth to it though. No, what I was going to say is like, it's just so typical. So if my wife gets mad at me, then that makes me mad.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what are you mad at me for? But as soon as she acts like sad, like the vulnerable kind of emotions, then I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm awful. So like, you see it in marriage, like the vulnerable emotion is actually really much more effective.
Yeah.
At getting me to change my behavior, then, the anger typically, then I get mad because you're mad, well, you shouldn't be mad at that.
Yeah.
What are you mad for?
Yeah.
It's just dumb,
Yeah.
It's the way humans do. And so all that's human nature, right? I get mad because you're mad. I'm mad over here. So I'm going to yell over here. And, I'm hurt at this. So I'm out of sorts at work and I'm not productive. And like we're so like emotionally dysfunctional like that.
Yeah.
And then in a story like this, we see Jesus really pushed to the brink emotionally, really devastated, really sad. And it would be so normal to look at this crowd and be like, y'all are so selfish. Do you know that my cousin just died a couple days ago because the king killed him because he's having an affair? And the woman asked, do you know what happened to me? And y'all are over here, and all I want is a day. I just want one day off to go up on the hill and to pray and maybe to have dinner with my close friends. And now there's 1,000 people. That would just be so normal.
And it would be such a great sermon to preach, nowadays. To be like, and as Jesus said, leave me alone.
Yeah, you got to have boundaries. As Jesus said, healthy boundaries make good relationships, right? It would be absolutely totally normal now. But
it'd be the parable of the man cave.
Yeah, something, right? But he doesn't do that. It says he looks on them and he with compassion. Yeah. So even when he's pushed to his brink, he still goes to the well of compassion and chooses to do right by these people who really have absolutely no consideration for him.
Yeah.
Like none. They don't care that he's hurt, that he's emotional, that he's upset. They just don't care.
Right.
And here they are. And so
it's like they're his children or something.
Well, they're childish for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. You really just, all need, no thought for sure. Yeah. They're children of God, right? Yeah, there you go. It says he had compassion and healed their sick. And then it says when evening came, and it kind of goes on from there. So he did it all day. He spent the whole rest of the day putting his own emotions, his own feelings aside, operating out of compassion for these people, healing. I got to talk one time to a microsurgeon, like the guy that, puts your finger back on if it gets cut off.
Yeah.
And I'll get the exact details of this wrong because I don't remember the exact number of hours and minutes and all that kind of stuff. But there's not that many guys that can do that job, that can do those, put the capillaries back together and sew the nerves. And, it's meticulous and it requires I think so, doing work, in a magnifying lens for hours. And this guy was telling me about how he had a day where, some kid comes in the OR and he's cut a finger or two off and so you got to do it right then. You can't just be like, well, bring him back next week because obviously it won't work by then. It's got to happen immediately. So he goes in and spends I forget what he said, but it was hours, 5, 6, 7 hours putting this kid's fingers back on, and he's ready to go home exhausted. And somebody came in the OR right then. Same thing. They some other person had been in some sort of accident, something got torn off, and it's your options are to go spend another 6 or 8 hours with your head in a scope doing microfine surgery, or this person loses a limb the rest of their life. And he's like, and so you just take a deep breath and you go do it. Yeah. Because you guys out of compassion, he doesn't need the money, but it's if I don't do this, the consequences are the rest of his life for this person. So, and Jesus is operating like that. He's like, well, these people need to be healed. They need to hear. They need to, now I'm going to choose to put my needs and wants aside and go function. Mm-hmm. And so he does.
I like that with videos, man. People call, they need a video.
Yeah.
It's I don't care if it's your birthday, son.
Just get on it, right? Just do it.
These files aren't going to render themselves. I got to do it.
That's right. They're going to edit themselves or anything. You got to get it done. So Jesus, he works all day long. And then at the end of it, again, it would be normal to be like, all right, bye. See you guys.
Yeah.
Instead, he decides he wants to feed everybody. It says, when evening came, the disciples approached him and said, this place is deserted and it's already late. Send the crowds away so they get to the village and buy food. And Jesus says, they don't need to go away hungry. You feed them. Well, and of course, the story, I don't want to go full into the feeding of the 5,000, but he gets the loaves and the fishes and he does that whole miracle of provision. So he kind of goes this step beyond not just the healing and the preaching, but he also says, hey, let me do this miracle. And he takes the loaves and fishes and starts tearing them up and, I always kind of joke and say he made fish sandwiches, because it's fish and bread, and it was enough for everybody. I'm sure they were really good because Jesus made them. And so he does that whole miracle. feeds everybody. Now he finally gets some time alone. Okay, day's way over. And so after the people were fed, it says immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Okay, so he dismisses the crowds. The disciples get in the boat, head back, home to Capernaum, I guess. And it says after dismissing the crowd, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. So finally, he does get his time away from everybody to pray, cry, process what happened with his cousin, where he was in life, what's going on. And so that's pretty cool. And then you have to think of now we shift the focus from Jesus and what's going on with him to the guys in the boat. Because they've been along for this ride all day too, right? They were there when the news broke. They saw Jesus upset. They tried to get him away. Then they ministered all day. They're exhausted too because they're working too. They're helping handle the crowds. They're handing out the food. They're not just sitting there. They're his workers. And so they're exhausted. And he says, take the boat back home. And they're good. So they listen. And they get in the boat. And it says, so he goes up on the mountain. Jesus is crying and praying. And it says, meanwhile, the boat was already some distance from the land, battered by the waves because the wind was against him. Now, what you got to know at Sea of Galilee is that the lake is really not that big. I actually have a friend who ran, the whole circuit, and it's a little more than 40 miles.
Okay.
So it's about 40 miles around. I forget the exact length, and it's twice as long as it is, or, it's taller than it is wide, So I want to say it's 6 or 7 miles across, about 13 miles north to south, but that's roughly. And it's kind of shaped like a harp. They call it the kinneret in Hebrew, which means the harp, because that's the way it's shaped. But from any hill surrounding it, you can see the whole thing. So Jesus can see; they're in full view of his as all this is going on. So they're trying to paddle. If it's sort of on a diagonal, maybe 10, 12 miles, they're trying to go at the most. And that's probably about right. And so they're in the middle, about 5 ways in, about maybe 4 or 5 miles in. They're just not making any progress. Now, at this point, let's pause and talk for a second because I grew up in the Gulf South, sort of South Alabama, so Mobile, beaches, Gulf Shores, that part of the world. So I grew up on boats, and my grandfather always had kind of like cabin cruisers, like 30, 40-foot boats you could sleep on. And so we would go out and spend nights in the water. We went out, fishing all the time. So I was very much accustomed to, we've been out in storms before, and, it could be real scary, actually. A few times when I was a kid, we were out and some things happened that were pretty interesting, And so when I moved to Israel, and the first time I went to Sea of Galilee, I hadn't read all these stories all my life. There's a lake.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, huh? Like, how are you getting dangerous waves? It's a lake. It's not even that big a lake. I mean, there's definitely lakes in Alabama that are bigger, and Georgia, that are bigger than the Sea of Galilee. So, like, what's going on here? And so, like, without really talking to anybody, I just sort of developed some theories. And one of my theories was, well, their boats must have been really small, junky. They must have just been awful. These boats they were using must have been tiny and poor and like poorly made, or like maybe that was the issue. Or trying to figure out how these stories make sense based on that lake I'm looking at. Well, then the Israeli archaeologists, they unearthed, they call it the Jesus boat. It's at one of the kibbutzim around the lake. You can go see it. They actually, there was a drought one year and the lake dropped. And it revealed one of these boats. It was encased in mud, and it's actually really amazing. They kind of like scooped it out, injected foam into it so they can encase it in foam so it wouldn't fall apart, pulled it out of the water, picked the foam away from it, and sort of put all these little suspension. They kind of like suspended all the parts of it to keep it tight. It's pretty amazing. But you can see the boat, and it's like 30 or 40 feet long. It's pretty big, and it looks like it's probably pretty well made. And so that theory was shot. And so I'm like, well, that doesn't make too much sense. I don't know how to make sense of these stories. Well, so years later, I just sort of put that aside. I was like, oh, something happened. I don't know. And I had to import a car. I bought a car in America because cars in Israel cost a fortune. And I bought it and shipped it over. And I hired an older gentleman. He was like, in his mid to late 70s then, to help me as a agent to like get my car out of the port, which takes forever. It's a racket over there. And so I had to drive with him up to Haifa 2 or 3 days in a row to do all the paperwork to get my car out of the container. And one day we started talking about the Sea of Galilee. And this guy lived on the coast in a place called Netanya. But he starts telling me about, he's like, when I was a young man, we used to go to the Sea of Galilee every Shabbat, so Saturday, to go water skiing. And I was like, really? That's interesting. That's kind of like walking on water in its own way. So you're water skiing on the Sea of Galilee. That's pretty cool. I was like, so how was that? And he was like, well, back then, because this was in the early 60s before the 1967 war. So Syria owned the Golan Heights. The hills overlooked one side of the lake, the eastern side. And he was like, well, back in those days, if you were water skiing on the lake, you had to be careful because if you got too close to the eastern side, the Syrians would shell your boat. I was like, so you used to go water skiing and they would shoot artillery at your boat sometimes? He's like, yeah. So we tried to stay out that way. I was like,
we
so
tried to stay out, but
yeah.
they just shoot.
So it's like, you've had people shoot artillery shells at you while you water skied? And he's like, yeah, a couple times. And I'm like, that's pretty cool. That's, sort of James Bond right there. And so I'm like, well, that's pretty neat. And then he says, yeah. He says, but this Kinneret, it's crazy. You have to be so careful. And I'm like, wait, because I'm thinking about, the Bible stories come to my mind. I'm like, wait, pause. What do you mean? He's like, well, if a storm comes up, you have to go in right away. And I'm like, in a modern boat? Like, you got a ski boat. This is a 20-foot modern sealed vessel with the bilge pump.
Yeah.
You got to get in. He's like, oh, yeah, storms are awful. Really? And he starts telling me about how they almost died one time in a storm and how they would just like the waves would just roll over the boat and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, on a lake. Who knew? So the next time I was there, I was at the church group and they had these like sort of big, they call them the Jesus boats. They're just a 40-foot boat that they've sort of fake decorated to look like a boat.
You just got to put Jesus
from back in the day, and you put a fake sail on it and stuff. So it looks like whatever. And, so we're out there on one of those, and these are large modern vessels, like 40, 50-foot boats. And so I asked the pilot, I was like, hey, does it ever get rough enough out here y'all can't operate? And he's like, oh, yeah, it's time it gets really bad. And so you do the research, what you find is that there are times, certain times of the year, particularly in the winter, but the Sea of Galilee sits about 700 feet below sea level. And what happens is that cold air coming off from the sea, which is actually above it, from the west, comes in, and the mountains are shaped, and it's a long explanation. The mountains are shaped in a certain way that it sort of funnels the air in, but then the air actually kind of goes down. It's a cold drafts come down and hit the lake in a certain way that creates really, really shockingly big waves for a body of water that size. And they're very rough and they're very choppy, and it gets really windy, and boats can't operate. So what do you know? Your Bible is telling you the truth. Okay, that they really did have really severe storms on the lake, and that sometimes they were actually very, very dangerous, and still to this day dangerous to even modern boats. So that was a long aside for a little bit of geography, but it's a true thing. So these guys get out. They're in the middle of the lake. They're halfway there. They're doing their absolute best what he told them, because he told them to go from point A to point B. They're halfway there, a third of their way there. They're working as hard as they can. They're rowing against the wind. They're fighting against the wind, and they're making absolutely no progress. And the whole time, Jesus sees the whole thing because he's on the hill, and you can see the whole lake. I think it's a wonderful metaphor for life, because for sure there are times, and I know at least in my life, when I had been working as hard as I can, putting everything I know into doing something I'm pretty sure is the right thing and the right thing to do and what God would want me to do, and just making absolutely no progress. And you really do want to have these frustrated moments where you look up at the heavens and you're like, do you see this? Do you see me? Do you see me trying to do what you want me to do?
Yeah.
And it's really hard. It's really annoying. I don't want to do this anymore. And to the disciples' credit, they're persistent. They don't just give up and go back. They don't, they're out in the middle of the lake rowing away, And it says, the wind was against them, and Jesus came toward them walking on the sea very early in the morning. So he lets them struggle for hours. Like for hours. It goes from the evening. Now it's early. It's 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. They've been fighting the waves for a long time. They're dead exhausted. They're also probably really scared by this point because now they really are in danger for their lives, and it's a big, nasty storm. And so he goes to them walking on the water, and that's pretty cool. It says, you have to imagine, we've read these stories before, so we're not affected by them how we should be. If you saw someone walking on the water, it would weird you out. That's not normal stuff. So they see it, and they think it's a ghost. They think they're dying. We're about to die. We're already seeing it. Like we're seeing the spirits. We're on our way to join them. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus speaks back to them and says, have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Peter is, he always has funny reactions to things. Instead of being scared or in awe, he's sort of like, whoa, this is so cool, So he says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, I always think like, well, what if it was not Jesus, but it was some other, if they were right about the ghost thing and some spirit says, yeah, come on out here, then he had died, but okay. So Jesus says, come to me on the water, or Peter says, we say that, and Jesus says, come on. And then Peter jumps out of the boat. And it says, climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water and came towards Jesus. Now, at this point, I think it's worth pointing something out or saying something, which is what we normally do with this story is we kind of use it to criticize, kind of dump on Peter. Oh, Peter didn't have any faith. He looked away. He started caring about, and we don't think about the fact that he had more faith and courage than the other 12 guys. Like the other 12 guys never got out of the boat. Like, so he demonstrated really, really remarkable courage and faith to jump out of the boat at all, and I think in that, again, all of these stories, Matthew could have written about anything. He witnessed thousands of days. Why is he telling us about this? Because there's a point to be taken from it. There's a lesson to be learned in it. And I think the lesson to be learned in it is jump out of the boat. So many of us spend so much of our lives paralyzed by fear, worry, concern. We want to have everything worked out completely before we'll do anything. And we don't want to make a mistake. And we're scared about this. We're scared. And we really just spend years and years of our life just paralyzed into inactivity. And I see that all the time with people. I talk to people that, they hear about what we're doing and some of the missionary stuff that we're doing. And they're like, oh, I want to get involved. And I'm like, well, we'll come. You've got a skill set that would be great for, this work or this minute. And you sort of tell them things, and they're like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
And you can tell that there's like this tug or this pull that like they would really want to do it. But then there's also this like fear thing, like, well, what if it doesn't work? What if I can't, I'm saying, like, what if somehow it falls apart and I mess up and it doesn't work and maybe the finances don't work out or and I think there's all kinds of people that have all sorts of dreams and aspirations, often from God. Maybe it's about business, like launch out and start your own thing or I don't know, whatever. And, maybe it's some teenage boy who's scared to ask some girl out, whatever it is, like we just spend so much time tied up in fear of consequences and locked up that we don't do, right. And we don't have to be perfect. Peter's going to screw this up, but you know what? The other 12 guys never got to walk on water. He had the courage to go out there and he got to have an experience that he would remember for the rest of it, for all eternity, I guess. And it would be commemorated, by all these people. So to me, the first thing is just daggum jump out of the boat,
I have so much to say about that.
Oh yeah? Say away.
No, I mean, two things. One, So this is the exact analogy that I've have for multiple things in life, but when my wife and I planted a church about 8 years ago, and it was like, I don't know, I feel like we're the only people equipped to do this in this context and in this community. And it was like, I'm not qualified to do this. And the entire time, this was like kind of the picture was like, okay, like you're walking and you just got to you've got to remind yourself to not really pay attention to the wind and the waves. And like, I'm just like going to keep walking. I'm just going to keep walking. I'm just going to take the next step. And yeah, I'm like super nervous about what's on my left and my right, but I'm just going to just keep doing that thing. And when you do get distracted by those things, you usually end up making bad decisions that you then have to spend lots of time and energy getting yourself out of to get them back on track, to then ignore everything and just keep doing the right thing again. But this was one of those verses that was like, this is just where we have to live for an indefinite amount of time until we get to like the next island, essentially, of stability.
So there's so many ways to like think. There's so many lessons to draw from that and think about. So I know a man who was on a Holy Land trip, and he was on one of the boats that they take out on the lake on the Sea of Galilee. And on the trip he was on, there was a woman who was in her 80s, an older woman who had spent a lifetime reading these stories. And I guess she felt like if you had enough faith, you could walk on the water there. And so in the middle of the tour, as the boat's, going around the lake, this lady just absolutely stepped right off the back of the boat.
And
she didn't walk.
Did she drown or she just
No, she didn't die, but a couple of men did have to quick jump in and get her out, and they had to save her.
Yeah.
But this lady, and he tells
so
a story.
Maybe this wasn't like a literal.
So maybe not for her. So she, she gave it a go. Didn't work out for her, and so that begs a question. And the question is, what's the difference between Peter and this lady? Because it worked for Peter, didn't work for her.
Right.
Same place, also on a boat, And to me, the answer is, well, Jesus called Peter to go out there.
Yeah.
And this gets into a little bit of murky water, but like, the Bible, Jesus says that, my kids know my voice. And there are times, and it's very difficult to sit here and say, how do you know when the Lord is speaking to you or when he tells you to do something? But there's times you're supposed to do something.
I can't really explain it, but there's definitely just there's like times when, you kind of know when you have that like, if I don't, like I have to do this, and if I don't, I'm not being obedient, versus like, this is something I want to do. Like there's definitely a difference inside when it's like, this is something I feel like I want to do versus this is something I feel like I absolutely have to do, or I'm not.
And sometimes those things can align. Sometimes you can want to do something you're supposed to do, but sometimes not.
Yeah.
You thinking more not?
Yeah, it's not, it's hard to know. It's usually the things you don't feel like I don't know if I don't really want to do this.
Yeah. But you just kind of know that, and that's hard to describe, but there's times you're supposed to jump, right? And so then in that moment, you got to jump. And what I see in talking to people is I see a lot more people on this earth in our current culture who regret things they didn't do. I see more people regret what they didn't do than regret what they did. I don't meet that many people who tried something big, for God or in life and failed. And are like, I wish I'd never tried that. I meet tons of people who say, I wish I had tried.
I wish I had done this.
Yeah. And that regret of what you didn't do, it's just not a place that you want to be, And, that missed opportunity. I met a guy one time who had a business that was worth a fortune, And I was like, how'd you do that? And he was like, well, the first 6 businesses I started went bankrupt, and I didn't let it discourage me. He was like, well, I just kept trying until I found one that worked.
Yeah.
And he didn't have any regret over the 5 or 6 businesses that went bankrupt. He's like, yeah, I learned from every single one of them, and then I got it right. So it's good.
Well, and yeah, that's kind of what I was saying. Like the two things that I was going to say, like, there's this aspect of like truly following something that God, you feel like is calling you to do, and not in like not like a, I don't know what to call it, like in a disingenuous way or a hyper spiritual way, like, oh, God's calling me to do this, and it's like, well, and then people are like, really, like that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't mean it to be in a manipulative or like, but literally like
but you know when it's genuine. When you started that church, right, you know you genuinely felt like I'm supposed to give myself to doing this.
Yeah,
there's probably a lot of hard work and a lot of commitment that would have been easier to not do it.
Yes, like lots of crazy stuff happened during that time, but it's like one of those things you look back and you're like, and lots of bad stuff happened to us during that time, but I'm like, I wouldn't trade it.
Yeah.
You know, good things, but more bad. But it's one of those things that you're like, sometimes you're like, well, you look at it now and you're like,
but you don't know what the impact of that was and what you learned and who you impacted.
But I don't mean bad. I don't mean bad.
Just difficult.
More of a pruning season.
Yeah.
And pruning is painful, but it's necessary for growth.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at that, you're like, in the process, you're like, this sucks really bad. But then you're like, on the other end of it, you're like, oh, that was definitely God doing stuff.
So you were talking about the whole thing of like, one of the distractions is not feeling equipped, or like, I'm not, who am I to do this?
Well, yeah. So like, that's two things. One, it's like that focusing on what God is calling you to do, and you don't feel equipped. If you're focusing on Him, much like Peter's doing, he obviously isn't
equipped to walk on water.
Yeah, he's not equipped to walk on water.
He doesn't have flippers or fins or anything.
But if he's focusing on Jesus, then he's there, right? So that's one side. The other side is like the things you were just saying, which is like living a life of regret and being like, well, what if I fail? What if I fail? And I think professional sports is a great like way to view how you should overcome some of these things, which is like, professional athletes get paid millions of dollars to fail most of the time. I don't know if the World Series is happening right now, and the
best hitter hits about 300, about 30%.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the NBA is pretty much the same thing. The great shooters are like 33%. Maybe
50% shooter is very rare.
Maybe like a career high 30s in a 3-point line is like amazing.
Oh, for sure, 3-pointers.
And I'm like, dude, that is not that high. Yeah. If you think about that.
No, you're missing a lot more than you're making.
So I'm going out here and I'm shooting 10 and I'm making
3 or 4.
3 or 4. I could do that.
Yeah.
And
the best shooters, the way I've heard it is they have no conscience. The fact they just missed 5 in a row in no way dissuades them from taking the next one.
But that's not what people assume. They're like, okay, well, in order to do this, succeed, you got to be good. No, you need to be persistent. You need to have endurance.
And you
need
also
to be
have
tenacious.
To just do something. Like so many people just like they talk about stuff that they want to do, that they're going to do, but they don't, it never crosses the line to doing. You really just have to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So many people just do nothing.
Yeah. I feel like just do it as a good.
It could. It would be marketable.
Yeah,
it would work.
That would be good.
So what I was going to say is like the whole thing about qualification. There's a really cool scripture that jumped at me last week. It's in Exodus 3 when God calls Moses, hey, go back to Egypt, confront Pharaoh, free the people. And Moses says, who am I that I can do this? Like, hey, whoa, pause. Are you kidding me? Like, I'm not qualified. And there's a couple of things there that are really interesting. First off is Moses is as qualified as anybody else. He grew up in the palace. He knows both Hebrew and Egyptian culture. He knows both the languages. He knows his way around the palace. He knows where he is actually remarkably well equipped to do it, maybe better than anyone else in history. And God wove his past in, his childhood in such a way as to prepare him to do it. But God doesn't actually mention any of his qualifications, talents, abilities, background, nothing. God says, I'll go with you. I'll go with you. Oh, okay, well then it'll work. And so, there is a big deal and as a believer with the Holy Spirit working in your life, to knowing the things that God has called you, that he will go with you. And if God will go with you the same way he was with Peter, and he said, come on, then you just need to get out of the boat. And if you don't, you're being really stupid, and you're missing out on, again, Peter got to walk on water. Now, as we go on, Peter's going to screw it up. But you know what? God knew he was going to screw it up. The same way he knows you're going to screw up, in doing the things you've been called to do. Like, yeah, you're going to screw up. You're stupid. You're a human. You're flawed. You're going to get angry. You're going to make mistakes. Like, yeah. And God knew all that. Like, he knew all that. He knew just exactly how incompetent you were when he called you. Mm-hmm. So what? Go, yeah, stop worrying about those things. If he's going with you, you're going to be fine. So Peter jumps out of the boat, right? And starts walking towards Jesus, making good progress. He's clearly in first place at this point. 11 guys in the boat. He's out on the water, walking on the water. He's winning.
Yeah.
Okay. Which I don't think we emphasize nearly enough. The courage and the faith that he had to jump out of the boat, which most people don't have. Okay. Then something weird happens. It says, but when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. So I think this is also so instructional in our life, is that for those of us, and I think I've done some jump out of the boat stuff in my life. I hope so. For those of us who jump out of the boat, what can happen, and this definitely has happened to me, is we have enough faith to jump out of the boat. We have enough faith that God can do the miracle that I walk on this wave, and that he can do the miracle that I walk on wave number 2, and maybe wave number 3. But at some point we're like, is he really going to keep doing miracles like every single wave? I don't know. Is he going to keep paying attention to me? Is he going to keep sustaining me? Is that, what I'm saying? We have enough faith for like a miracle or two. We don't have enough faith for continual sustained provision and him taking care of us. And so all of a sudden it's like, well, I gotta be, and we lose that focus, right? So it's just odd. Like for some people, the issue isn't building up the faith to take the leap. It's sustaining it, and I look back in my life and see times where I think I clearly fell into that category, where it's like I had enough faith to do something kind of crazy and it kind of halfway worked out, but then to like sustain it and stay in it and go, you got scary, the same way Peter was like, oh, I'm doing this. Oh, there's a wave. Is it gonna, and then you lose focus, I think that's also just very real for how humans work. Yeah. But then Peter does something else that I think makes sense. So what do you do? So let's say you jumped out of the boat. You started off in some sort of, crazy venture, something you thought the Lord was leading you into. It's a ministry thing, a business thing, a relationship thing. I don't know. You've adopted a kid. You've done something that is crazy, life leap, jump, risky for God because you felt called to do it. And again, you get kind of a miracle or two down the road, but then it's still scary. And a lot of us want to be like, it was a mistake. Back to the boat, And then you start to sink, you start to drown. Real normal. What Peter does when he starts to sink is he has enough sense. So, what he doesn't do is he doesn't go to like the, hey guys, throw me a line. He doesn't, try to rely on his amazing aquatic swimming skills. He just says, Lord, save me. I'm in trouble. And Jesus is there. And so it says immediately Jesus reached out his hand. So Jesus gets over there, picks him up, and he says, you have little faith, why'd you doubt? He was like, you were doing great. Jesus is like, you were making it. Why'd you start doubting? And he went, oh no. And he said, when we got in the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him and said, you truly are the Son of God. And then it all closes. So like, that's a pretty crazy day. You found your cousin died. You minister all day. You feed 5,000 people. You walk on water. That's a pretty crazy. It says when they had crossed over, they came to the shore at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized them, they alerted the whole vicinity and brought to him all who were sick and they begged him they might not touch the end of his robe, and as many as touched it were healed. So basically, it just started all over again. After that night, they got to a new place, and they're like, please heal us here. And it just goes again and again and again. And I think, like, how on earth did Jesus sustain compassion, care, love for people? He's taking care of Peter that night, teaching him something, mourning for his cousin, working with people. And then it's like, and they wake up next morning and like, there we go again, you know? And that's kind of our lives too, right? You work and it's relentless. You know, tomorrow's going to have its demands too, you know? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's the story.
That's good. There's a lot there. We went a little long, but you know, I think it's good.
Maybe long's the new normal or something. I don't know.
Yeah, if we start saying we're going long constantly, we might need to rethink the language.
Or just shorten up.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all for this one. So as always, for more content, check us out on thelandandthebible.com, and we will see you later.
Yay.